Sarah Martinez had been working as a security contractor in Afghanistan for 3 years when everything changed on that Tuesday morning in October. The forward operating base near Kandahar was buzzing with the usual activity. Supply convoys rolling in, helicopters landing and taking off, soldiers going about their daily routines. But Sarah knew something was different. She had seen the signs, heard the whispered conversations, noticed the unusual movement patterns around the perimeter. As a former military intelligence officer turned private contractor, Sarah possessed skills that most people on the base didn't fully understand or appreciate. Her ability to read situations, analyze patterns, and detect threats had saved lives before. But today, when she tried to warn the base commander about what she had observed, she was met with dismissive looks and patronizing smiles. "Listen, Martinez," Colonel Henderson had said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "I appreciate your concerns, but we have everything under control here. The perimeter is secure, our intelligence is solid, and, frankly, I don't need a civilian contractor telling me how to run my base." Sarah had tried to explain what she had seen during her morning security rounds. The unusual positioning of local vendors near the main gate. The way certain individuals have been photographing the base from different angles over the past week. The strange pattern of vehicle movements she had noticed during her analysis of the security footage. Most importantly, the intercepted radio chatter she had picked up using equipment that technically she wasn't supposed to have access to. "Sir, with respect, I've been doing this kind of work for over a decade," Sarah had insisted. "What I'm seeing suggests coordinated reconnaissance. Someone is planning something big, and they're planning it for today." Colonel Henderson had finally looked up, his expression a mixture of annoyance and condescension. "Ms. Martinez, I understand you want to feel important and justify your presence here, but spreading panic based on your personal hunches is not helpful. We have trained intelligence officers, surveillance systems, and established protocols. If there was a real threat, we would know about it." The other officers in the room had exchanged glances, some smirking slightly. Sarah recognized the look. It was the same expression she had encountered throughout her career whenever she tried to voice concerns that others didn't want to hear. Being a woman in a male-dominated field had taught her to expect skepticism, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. "Colonel, I'm not trying to cause panic," Sarah had said, keeping her voice steady despite her growing frustration. "I'm trying to prevent a catastrophe. The patterns I'm seeing suggest a multi-vector attack plan for some time in the next few hours. The enemy has been studying our routines, our shift changes, our vulnerable points." Major Roberts, the base's intelligence officer, had leaned back in his chair with a dismissive laugh. "Look, lady, I've been running intelligence operations in this region for 2 years. We monitor all radio frequencies. We have human intelligence assets throughout the area, and our drone surveillance covers a 20-mile radius. Nothing happens here without us knowing about it." Sarah had felt her heart sink as she realized they weren't going to listen. In her bag, she carried a tablet containing detailed analysis of movement patterns, radio intercepts, and photographic evidence she had gathered over the past week. But she could see in their faces that no amount of evidence would convince them to take her seriously. "Gentlemen," she had tried one more time, "I'm begging you to at least increase security protocols for today. Double the patrols, put extra guards on the towers, maybe delay some of the scheduled convoys. If I'm wrong, the worst thing that happens is we waste some manpower for one day. If I'm right, and you ignore this." Colonel Henderson had stood up abruptly, signaling the end of the conversation. "Ms. Martinez, your contract here is for perimeter security and facility maintenance. It does not include strategic planning or threat assessment. I suggest you stick to your assigned duties and leave the military operations to the professionals." As Sarah left the command center, she felt a familiar mixture of anger and helplessness. Throughout her career, first as an Army intelligence officer and later as a private contractor, she had encountered this same attitude countless times. Her warnings were dismissed as paranoia, her analysis was questioned, and her expertise was undermined simply because she was a woman working in a field dominated by men who believed they always knew better. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 3 deployments and built a reputation as one of the most effective security contractors in the region by giving up when faced with skepticism. If the official channels wouldn't listen, she would find other ways to prepare for what was coming. She spent the next hour reviewing her evidence one more time, making sure her analysis was correct. The radio intercepts clearly indicated coordination between multiple groups. The surveillance photos showed the same individuals conducting reconnaissance from different positions over several days. The movement patterns suggested a sophisticated understanding of the base's routines and vulnerabilities. Sarah had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something big was about to happen. The question was whether she could do anything about it without official support. She decided to reach out to some of the younger soldiers she had worked with over the months. Men and women who had seen her in action and knew she wasn't someone who cried wolf. Sergeant First Class Mike Thompson was one of them. He had served under her briefly when she was still active duty, and he respected her judgment even if the officers didn't. "Sergeant Thompson," she said when she found him near the motor pool, "I need to talk to you about something important." Mike looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "What's up, Martinez? You look worried." Sarah quickly explained her concerns, showing him some of the evidence on her tablet. Mike's expression grew more serious as he reviewed the information. Unlike the officers in the command center, he had learned to trust Sarah's judgment through experience. "This looks bad," he said quietly. "What do the higher-ups say?" "They think I'm being paranoid," Sarah replied. "Colonel Henderson basically told me to mind my own business and stick to my assigned duties." Mike shook his head in frustration. Classic. They never listen until it's too late. He thought for a moment. "Look, I can't officially do anything without orders, but I can make sure my squad is extra alert today. Maybe position us in places where we can respond quickly if something happens." Sarah felt a small sense of relief. At least someone was taking her seriously. "Thank you, Mike. I hope I'm wrong about all this, but if you're not, we'll be ready," Mike assured her. "You've never been wrong about this kind of stuff before." As Sarah continued her rounds throughout the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. Every hour that passed brought them closer to whatever was being planned, and the base continued its normal operations completely unaware of the danger. Around noon, she noticed increased activity among the local vendors outside the main gate. The same individuals she had been watching for days were now positioned at what appeared to be predetermined locations. Her radio equipment picked up a sudden increase in chatter on frequencies that had been quiet for weeks. Sarah tried once more to reach the command center, but Colonel Henderson was in a meeting, and Major Roberts told her bluntly that he didn't want to hear any more of her theories. The frustration was overwhelming, but Sarah had faced worse situations before. She would do what she could with the resources available to her. She spent the afternoon quietly alerting the few people who would listen. A handful of junior officers, some experienced NCOs, and a few other contractors who had learned to respect her judgment over the months. She couldn't organize an official response, but she could create an informal network of people who would be ready to act when the time came. As evening approached, the tension in Sarah's chest grew stronger. The radio chatter was becoming more frequent and more urgent. The movement patterns around the base were shifting in ways that suggested final preparations for something significant. Every professional instinct she had developed over years of intelligence work was telling her that the attack would come soon. Sarah positioned herself in the communications center where she had unofficial access to the base's monitoring equipment. If an attack came, she wanted to be in a position to coordinate response efforts, even if she had to do it without official authorization. At 1847 hours, her radio crackled with the first indication that her worst fears were about to be realized. Multiple vehicles were approaching the base from different directions, moving faster than normal traffic and maintaining radio silence except for brief coded transmissions. Sarah immediately tried to contact the command center, but the duty officer told her that Colonel Henderson was at dinner and didn't want to be disturbed unless it was a genuine emergency. When she insisted that this was exactly that kind of emergency, she was told to file a written report that would be reviewed in the morning. The frustration was almost unbearable, but Sarah didn't have time to argue with bureaucrats. She grabbed her radio and began alerting the informal network she had built throughout the day. "All stations, this is Martinez," she said quietly. "Pattern Alpha is active. Repeat, Pattern Alpha is active. Multiple vehicles approaching from sectors 3, 7, and 11. This is not a drill." Within minutes, she received acknowledgement from Sergeant Thompson and several others. They couldn't officially mobilize the base's defenses, but they could position themselves and their people in strategic locations. At 18:53 hours, the first explosion rocked the base. The attack came exactly as Sarah had predicted, a coordinated assault from multiple directions designed to overwhelm the base's defenses and create maximum confusion. Mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter, while vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices targeted the main gate and 2 secondary entrances simultaneously. The base's official response was slow and disorganized, exactly as Sarah had feared. The duty officers were caught completely off guard, and it took precious minutes for them to activate emergency protocols and begin coordinating defensive measures. But Sarah's informal network was ready. Sergeant Thompson and his squad were already in position near the main gate when the first VVIED detonated. Instead of being caught in the open like many others, they were able to immediately begin returning fire and organizing evacuation efforts for the wounded. The contractors and junior officers Sarah had warned were spread throughout the base in positions that allowed them to respond quickly to threats and coordinate rescue efforts. While the official command structure struggled to understand what was happening, Sarah's network was already saving lives. From her position in the communications center, Sarah coordinated the informal response efforts while simultaneously trying to gather intelligence about the scope and nature of the attack. Her radio equipment allowed her to monitor enemy communications and track the movement of hostile forces around the base. Martinez to all stations. She broadcast as explosions continued to rock the compound. Enemy forces are concentrated in 3 main groups. Primary assault on the main gate with approximately 20 fighters. Secondary team moving toward the fuel depot from the southwest. Third group positioning for mortar attacks from the ridgeline to the north. The information Sarah provided allowed the responding defenders to prioritize their efforts and position themselves more effectively. Even without official command authority, her analysis and coordination were beginning to turn the tide of the battle. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The attack pattern suggested this was more than just a raid. It was the opening phase of something much larger. And if her analysis was correct, the worst was yet to come. The battle raged for 47 minutes before Colonel Henderson finally made it to the command center. His uniform was disheveled, and there was a cut above his left eye from debris thrown by one of the explosions. The confident, dismissive officer who had rejected Sarah's warnings that morning now looked shaken and uncertain. "What's the situation?" he barked at Major Roberts, who was frantically trying to coordinate the base's response from multiple radio stations. "Sir, we're under coordinated attack from at least 3 directions," Roberts replied, his voice strained. "The main gate has been breached. We've got wounded throughout the compound, and enemy forces have penetrated the perimeter in several locations." Colonel Henderson looked around the command center in confusion. "How did this happen?" "Our intelligence indicated no immediate threats in this area." Major Roberts hesitated, glancing toward where Sarah was still coordinating defensive efforts on her radio equipment. "Sir, there were some warnings earlier today, but we assessed them as not credible." It was at that moment that Sarah's voice cut through the chaos in the command center. She was speaking rapidly into her radio, providing real-time intelligence to the defenders scattered throughout the base. "Bravo team, you've got approximately 8 hostiles moving toward your position from the northeast. They're using the maintenance building for cover. Charlie team, the mortar position on the north ridge has shifted east about 200 meters. Adjust your suppression fire accordingly." Colonel Henderson stared at Sarah with a mixture of recognition and growing realization. "Martinez," he called out, What exactly are you doing? Sarah looked up from her radio without stopping her coordination efforts. Sir, I'm trying to keep our people alive. The attack is unfolding exactly as I predicted this morning. And right now I'm the only person in this room who has a complete picture of what's happening out there. The colonel's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You were told to stay out of military operations. This is insubordination. Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled over the radio she was holding. Martinez, thank God you're there. We need immediate support at the main gate. We've got at least 15 wounded, and the enemy is regrouping for another push. Can you vector some help our way? Sarah immediately began coordinating with other teams to provide support for Thompson's position, completely ignoring Colonel Henderson's outburst. Lives were at stake, and she wasn't about to let military bureaucracy prevent her from doing what needed to be done. Major Roberts had been listening to Sarah's coordination efforts, and despite the colonel's anger, he was beginning to understand that she was providing intelligence and coordination that their official systems had failed to deliver. Sir, he said quietly to Henderson, she seems to know what's happening out there better than anyone else. Maybe we should— I don't want to hear it, Henderson snapped. This woman has been nothing but trouble, and now she's trying to take over my command during a crisis. But even as he spoke, the effectiveness of Sarah's informal coordination network was becoming impossible to ignore. The defenders she had positioned and was now directing were holding key positions throughout the base, preventing the enemy from achieving their objectives and buying time for a more organized response. Sarah's radio crackled again. This time, it was one of the contractors she had warned earlier. Martinez, we've got a problem at the fuel depot. It looks like they're trying to plant explosives. We need immediate backup, or this whole place is going up. Without hesitation, Sarah began redirecting available personnel toward the fuel depot. Her knowledge of the base layout, combined with her real-time intelligence gathering, allowed her to vector responders along routes that avoided enemy positions. Delta Team, proceed to the fuel depot via the South Maintenance Road. Avoid the main thoroughfare. It's under direct fire from the water tower position. Echo Team, can you provide covering fire for Delta's approach? Colonel Henderson watched in growing frustration as Sarah continued to effectively command the base's defense despite his orders to stop. But the results were undeniable. Casualty reports were lower than expected, key facilities were being protected, and the enemy's advance was being contained. The turning point came when Sarah's radio equipment picked up enemy communications indicating a major assault plan for the command center itself. The attackers had identified the base's nerve center and were planning to overrun it within the next few minutes. Colonel, Sarah said urgently, finally turning away from her radio. They know where we are, and they're coming for the command center. We have maybe 5 minutes before they hit this building with everything they've got. Henderson's face went pale. How do you know this? Because I've been monitoring their communications all day, Sarah replied. The same communications I tried to warn you about this morning. Major Roberts looked between them nervously. Sir, if she's right, we need to either reinforce this position or evacuate to a secondary command location. Sarah was already back on her radio, calling in every available defender to protect the command center. But she knew it might not be enough. The enemy had committed significant resources to this attack, and they were clearly well informed about the base's layout and defenses. That's when they heard the helicopters. The sound came from the south, growing louder by the second. At first, everyone in the command center assumed it was enemy aircraft, but Sarah's radio equipment was picking up American military communications on secure frequencies. This is Trident 1-6, requesting immediate situation report from Kandahar Forward Operating Base. Came a calm, professional voice over the military emergency frequency. Major Roberts grabbed the radio. Trident 1-6, this is Kandahar, FOB Actual. We are under heavy attack from multiple enemy forces. Command center is about to be overrun. Copy that, Kandahar. Trident 1-6 is a Navy SEAL QRF inbound to your location. We need accurate intelligence on enemy positions and friendly locations. Colonel Henderson reached for the radio, but Sarah was already responding. Her hours of coordinating the defense had given her the most complete picture of a tactical situation. Trident 1-6, this is Martinez, acting tactical coordinator. I have real-time intelligence on all enemy positions and can guide you in. There was a brief pause before the SEAL team leader responded. Martinez, this is Lieutenant Commander Hayes. We've been monitoring some of your transmissions. Impressive work down there. We're going to need that intelligence for our approach. Sarah quickly provided detailed information about enemy positions, friendly forces locations, and the most critical threats facing the base. Her analysis allowed the incoming SEAL team to plan their approach and identify priority targets. Colonel Henderson stood in stunned silence as he watched the woman he had dismissed that morning coordinate with one of the military's most elite units. The contrast between his earlier dismissive attitude and the current situation was stark and humiliating. The SEALs hit the base like a precision instrument. Using Sarah's intelligence, they were able to immediately target the enemy's command elements and heavy weapons positions. Within minutes of their arrival, the coordinated enemy attack began to fall apart. Outstanding intelligence, Martinez, came Lieutenant Commander Hayes' voice over the radio. Your tactical picture is more accurate than anything we've seen in months. How long have you been tracking these guys? Sarah couldn't help but glance at Colonel Henderson before responding. I've been monitoring the buildup for about a week, sir. Tried to raise the alarm this morning, but there were some communication issues. Hayes' response was immediate and pointed. Communication issues? Who the hell wasn't listening to intelligence this good? The question hung in the air of the command center. Major Roberts was staring at his feet, and Colonel Henderson's face had gone from pale to red with embarrassment. But Sarah was focused on the ongoing operation. Even with the SEALs' arrival, there were still enemy forces on the base, and the battle wasn't over. Trident 1-6, you've got approximately 12 hostiles holed up in the vehicle maintenance building. They've got at least 2 RPGs and have been using that position to control the main route through the base. Copy that. We'll take care of them. What about the mortar position on the ridge? Sarah checked her monitoring equipment. Still active, but they're running low on ammunition based on the decreased rate of fire. Estimate they'll be ineffective within 10 minutes unless they get resupplied. The SEAL team's assault was swift and devastating. Within 20 minutes of their arrival, organized enemy resistance had collapsed. The attackers who weren't killed or captured began fleeing back toward the border. As the gunfire died down and the base began assessing damage and casualties, Lieutenant Commander Hayes made his way to the command center. Sarah was still at her monitoring station, coordinating search and rescue efforts for any remaining wounded. Hayes was a tall, lean man in his mid-30s with the quiet confidence that came from years of special operations experience. He looked around the command center, taking in the scene, before his eyes settled on Sarah. Ms. Martinez, he said, extending his hand. Lieutenant Commander Michael Hayes, SEAL Team 5. I have to say, that was some of the best real-time intelligence coordination I've ever seen. Sarah shook his hand, suddenly, feeling the exhaustion of the past 12 hours. Thank you, sir. Just glad we were able to minimize casualties. Hayes turned to look at Colonel Henderson, who had been silent since the SEAL's arrival. Colonel, you got a real asset here. The intelligence picture she provided probably saved dozens of lives tonight. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Yes, well, Ms. Martinez is very thorough in her work. The SEAL officer's expression suggested he sensed there was more to the story. Thorough enough to predict a coordinated attack and position defensive assets before it happened, apparently. That kind of tactical awareness doesn't come from being thorough. It comes from being exceptionally skilled. Sarah appreciated the support, but she was more concerned with the aftermath of the attack. Sir, we need to do a complete security review. This attack was too well-coordinated and too well-informed to be a random raid. Someone provided detailed intelligence about our operations and vulnerabilities. Hayes nodded grimly. Agreed. We'll be conducting a full investigation, and I suspect we'll want to debrief you extensively about what you observed during your monitoring. Colonel Henderson finally found his voice. Now wait just a minute. Ms. Martinez is a civilian contractor with limited security clearance. Any investigation should be handled through proper military channels. The look Hayes gave Henderson could have frozen water. Colonel, this woman just demonstrated better intelligence analysis and tactical coordination than I've seen from most military intelligence units. If there's a security breach at this base, she's probably the best qualified person to help us identify it. The implications of Hayes' words weren't lost on anyone in the room. Sarah had not only been right about the attack, but her abilities had impressed one of the military's most elite units. The woman who had been dismissed as paranoid and told to mind her own business was now being sought out by Navy SEALs for her expertise. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The attack had been repelled, but the underlying threat remained. Someone had provided detailed intelligence to the enemy, and until that security breach was identified and addressed, the base remained vulnerable. Commander Hayes, she said, I think this attack was a test. They were probing our defenses and response capabilities. If I'm right, this won't be the last time they try something like this. Hayes studied her carefully. What makes you think that? Sarah pulled up her analysis on the tablet, showing him the patterns she had identified over the past week. The reconnaissance was too thorough, the timing was too precise, and the objectives were too specific. This wasn't about inflicting maximum casualties or capturing territory. They were gathering intelligence about how we respond to threats. As Hayes reviewed her analysis, his expression grew more serious. You may be right, which means we need to completely reevaluate security protocols here. He looked directly at Colonel Henderson, and we need to make sure that when intelligence professionals identify threats, those warnings are taken seriously. The message was clear, and Henderson knew it. The woman he had dismissed that morning had not only been right about the attack, but had probably saved his career and possibly his life. The question now was whether he would learn from the experience or continue to let his prejudices cloud his judgment. But Sarah wasn't thinking about vindication or recognition. She was thinking about the next attack and how they could be better prepared when it came. The investigation began at dawn the next morning. Lieutenant Commander Hayes had assembled a small team of specialists who worked through the night analyzing every aspect of the attack. By sunrise, they had confirmed what Sarah suspected. This had been far more than a random raid by opportunistic insurgents. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being the primary intelligence briefer for a room full of military officers who had ignored her warnings just 24 hours earlier. The meeting was held in a secure conference room, with Hayes leading the discussion and Colonel Henderson sitting conspicuously silent at one end of the table. The evidence is clear, Sarah began, displaying her analysis on the room's projection screen. The enemy had detailed intelligence about our operational patterns, security protocols, and physical layout. They knew exactly when our shifts changed, where our weak points were, and how long it would take us to mount an effective response. Major Roberts leaned forward nervously. Are you suggesting we have a security breach? Sarah nodded grimly. I'm saying we have a systematic intelligence compromise. Someone has been feeding detailed operational information to hostile forces, and yesterday's attack was designed to test the accuracy of that intelligence. Hayes added his own observations. The coordination and timing were too precise for this to be based on external observation alone. The attackers moved like they'd been inside this base, like they knew exactly where everything was located. The implications hung heavy in the room. Everyone present understood what this meant. There was likely a traitor among the base personnel, someone with access to operational details who was passing information to the enemy. Colonel Henderson finally spoke up. Even if that's true, how do we identify the source? We have over 300 personnel on this base, including contractors, interpreters, and support staff. Sarah had been thinking about this problem all night. Actually, sir, we can narrow it down significantly. Based on the specific intelligence the enemy demonstrated, they had access to information that's only available to a very small number of people. She changed the display to show a detailed breakdown of the intelligence the enemy had possessed. They knew our patrol schedules, which are only distributed to senior NCOs, and officers. They knew the location of our fuel depot security measures, which is restricted information. Most importantly, they knew the specific timing of our shift changes down to the minute. Hayes was studying the analysis carefully. How many people have access to all of this information? Based on the security protocols I've reviewed, maybe 20 people, Sarah replied. And if we eliminate those who were actively fighting during the attack and couldn't have been communicating with the enemy, we're down to perhaps half a dozen suspects. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications. One of their own colleagues, someone they trusted and worked with daily, had betrayed them and put their lives at risk. Major Roberts looked uncomfortable. This is a very serious accusation. We can't just start accusing people based on speculation. Sarah turned to face him directly. Sir, this isn't speculation. The enemy's knowledge was too detailed and too current to come from any other source. Yesterday's attack was essentially a field test to verify the intelligence they had received. Hayes nodded in agreement. She's right. The tactical execution demonstrated an understanding of this base that could only come from inside access. The question isn't whether we have a traitor, it's who it is and how we identify them. Colonel Henderson shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. What do you propose we do? Start surveillance on our own people? Conduct interrogations? Actually, Sarah said, I think there's a better way. If I'm right about this being a test, then whoever is providing intelligence to the enemy will need to report on the results. That gives us an opportunity to catch them in the act. She explained her plan. By monitoring all communications coming and going from the base, they could identify any unusual patterns or contacts that might indicate someone was reporting to external sources. Combined with careful observation of the potential suspects, they could narrow down the field quickly. Hayes was impressed with the approach. That sound counterintelligence work. How long would you need to set up this monitoring? The technical infrastructure is already in place, Sarah replied. I can have comprehensive monitoring operational within a few hours. The challenge will be analyzing the data quickly enough to identify the suspect before they can cause more damage. As they discussed the details of the surveillance operation, Sarah couldn't help but notice that several of the officers in the room seemed nervous about the prospect of having their communications monitored. Most of them probably just didn't like the idea of being under suspicion, but one person's discomfort might indicate something more significant. The meeting broke up with Sarah authorized to implement her monitoring plan immediately. For the first time since arriving at the base, she had official approval to use her full range of intelligence capabilities. The irony wasn't lost on her. It had taken a major attack and intervention by Navy SEALs for the base command to recognize her expertise. As the other officers filed out, Hayes remained behind to speak with her privately. Martinez, I have to ask, how long did you know this attack was coming? Sarah considered her answer carefully. I started picking up indicators about a week ago. The pattern became clear about 3 days before the attack. I tried to warn the command staff, but they wouldn't listen. Hayes finished for her. I've read your file, you know. Army intelligence officer, decorated service in Iraq, transition to private contracting. You've got more real-world experience than most of the people on this base. Sarah appreciated the recognition, but she was focused on the task ahead. Sir, catching the traitor is important, but I'm more concerned about what comes next. If yesterday was really a test, then they're planning something much larger. Hayes nodded grimly. That's what I'm afraid of. How much time do you think we have? Based on the patterns I observed, probably not long. They invested significant resources in yesterday's operation, which suggests they're moving towards some kind of deadline. I guess we have days, maybe a week at most. The weight of that assessment settled over both of them. If Sarah was right, they were in a race against time to identify the security breach and prepare for a much more serious attack. Sarah spent the rest of the day setting up her monitoring system. Using a combination of official equipment and her own specialized gear, she created a comprehensive surveillance network that could track all communications coming and going from a base. The system was sophisticated enough to identify patterns and anomalies that might indicate covert communication. By evening, she was ready to begin the hunt for the traitor. The first 24 hours of monitoring produced exactly what Sarah expected: a lot of routine communications and nothing obviously suspicious. But she knew that sophisticated traders didn't use obvious methods. They would communicate through seemingly innocent channels, using coded language or predetermined signals. On the second day, she began to notice patterns. Several people on her suspect list were communicating with contacts outside the base more frequently than normal. But one person stood out. Major Roberts, the base intelligence officer who had dismissed her warnings, was making regular calls to a number in Kandahar that didn't match any of his known contacts. The calls themselves seemed innocuous: discussions about supplies, weather conditions, and routine administrative matters. But Sarah's analysis revealed subtle patterns that suggested coded communication. References to specific numbers of vehicles, timing of deliveries, and personnel movements that didn't match the actual situation on the base. Sarah spent hours analyzing Robert's communications, cross-referencing them with her intelligence about enemy activities. Gradually, a disturbing picture emerged. Roberts wasn't just passing along routine information. He was providing detailed intelligence about the base's vulnerabilities and planned operations. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Roberts had access to all the information the enemy had demonstrated during the attack. His communication patterns matched what she would expect from someone conducting covert intelligence transfers. Most damning, his coded references corresponded to specific aspects of the base's defenses that the enemy had targeted most effectively. Sarah brought her findings to Hayes that evening, presenting a detailed analysis of Roberts' suspicious activities. The SEAL officer reviewed the evidence carefully, his expression growing darker with each piece of information. "This is solid work," Hayes said finally. "But we need more than patterns and suspicious communications. We need proof that would stand up to court-martial proceedings." Sarah had anticipated this concern. "I think I can get that proof, but it will require letting Roberts know that we're planning something he'll want to report to his handlers." She outlined a plan to feed Roberts false information about a planned operation, then monitor his communications to see if that information was passed along to enemy forces. If Roberts was indeed the traitor, he would feel compelled to warn his contacts about the supposed upcoming mission. Hayes considered the plan. "It's risky. If we're wrong about Roberts, we could be compromising operational security. And if he's as smart as he seems to be, he might detect the trap." "The risk is worth it," Sarah argued. "If Roberts is the traitor and we don't stop him soon, people are going to die. The intelligence he's providing is too detailed and too current. He has to be stopped." They decided to implement the plan the next morning. Sarah would brief Roberts on a fictional operation designed to transport a high-value target through the area. The details would be specific enough that if they were passed to enemy forces, it would be clear that Roberts was the source. But as they prepared to spring their trap, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something else was wrong. The evidence against Roberts was strong, but some aspects of the situation didn't fit. His behavior during the attack had seemed genuinely surprised and confused. His responses during the initial briefings had felt authentic, not like someone who was expecting the assault. Sarah spent that night reviewing everything again, looking for details she might have missed. As she went through Robert's communications one more time, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The coded communications weren't originating from Robert's personal devices. They were coming from his official military communication equipment, but the patterns suggested they were being sent when Roberts wasn't actually present in the communication center. Someone else was using Roberts' access credentials and communication equipment to pass intelligence to the enemy. Roberts wasn't the traitor. He was being framed by someone who had access to his systems and wanted to divert suspicion away from themselves. Sarah realized she had been looking at the wrong person entirely. The real traitor was still out there, still passing information to the enemy, and now they were planning to frame Roberts for their crimes. Worse, by focusing on Roberts, they might have tipped off the real traitor that they were getting close to the truth. As dawn broke over the base, Sarah knew she was running out of time. The real traitor was smart enough to frame a colleague and sophisticated enough to use someone else's communication systems. They had demonstrated patience and planning that suggested they had been operating for a long time. The question was whether Sarah could identify the real traitor before they struck again, and before an innocent man was destroyed by false accusations. The stakes had just gotten much higher, and the clock was ticking faster than ever. Hayes needed to know immediately that they had been pursuing the wrong suspect, and that the real threat was still active and potentially more dangerous than they had realized. The base was still compromised, the traitor was still feeding intelligence to the enemy, and their next attack could come at any time. Sarah gathered her evidence and headed for the command center, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether they could uncover the truth before it was too late. Sarah burst into the command center at 0545 hours to find Lieutenant Commander Hayes already there, reviewing overnight intelligence reports with a cup of coffee that looked like it had been brewing since midnight. The SEAL officer looked up as she entered, immediately recognizing the urgency in her expression. "We've got a problem," Sarah said without preamble. "Roberts isn't our traitor. Someone else is using his access credentials to send coded communications, and they're trying to frame him for the security breach." Hayes set down his coffee and gave her his full attention. "Show me." Sarah spread her analysis across the table, pointing to specific communication timestamps and access logs. "Look at this pattern. The suspicious communications are being sent from Robert's terminal, but they're happening when he's documented as being in other locations. Yesterday at 1430 hours, someone sent a coded message using his credentials while he was conducting a security briefing with Colonel Henderson." Hayes studied the data carefully. Could Roberts be using remote access to send these messages? "That's what I thought initially," Sarah replied. "But I checked the remote access logs. No one has used remote connectivity to his systems during any of these transmission times. Someone with physical access to his terminal is sending these messages." The implications hit Hayes immediately, which means our real traitor has access to the communications center and knows Robert's credentials. Sarah nodded grimly, and they're smart enough to frame him for their activities. If we had proceeded with our plan to trap Roberts, we would have publicly accused an innocent man while the real threat remained operational. Hayes was already reaching for his secure phone. "We need to brief Colonel Henderson immediately and expand our investigation. How many people have the kind of access that would allow them to use Robert's terminal?" Sarah had anticipated this question. Based on the access logs and duty schedules, 7 people had both the opportunity and technical access to send these messages. But when I cross-referenced that with who was present during the original intelligence briefings where I tried to warn about the attack, the list gets much shorter. She pulled out another document showing her narrowed analysis. 3 people meet all the criteria: Sergeant First Class Davidson from IT support, Captain Williams from logistics, and... She paused, checking her notes one more time before continuing. "And?" Hayes prompted. "And Master Sergeant Coleman from the communications section." Hayes frowned. Coleman has been at this base for over a year. His record is spotless, and he's been instrumental in maintaining communication security protocols. Sarah understood his skepticism. That's exactly what would make him valuable to enemy forces. His position gives him access to virtually all communication traffic. He understands security protocols well enough to circumvent them, and his long service record would deflect suspicion. As they discussed the implications, Colonel Henderson entered the command center looking haggard and worried. The events of the past few days had clearly taken a toll on him, and the prospect of dealing with a security breach involving his own personnel was weighing heavily. "Commander Hayes," Henderson said, "I've received word from higher headquarters that they're sending an investigation team. They want a full security review and accountability for how this attack was able to succeed." Hayes exchanged a glance with Sarah before responding. "Sir, we may have identified our security problem. MS. Martinez has uncovered evidence suggesting that someone has been using Major Roberts' communication access to pass intelligence to enemy forces." Henderson's face went pale. "Roberts? But he's my intelligence officer. He has access to virtually everything that happens on this base. That's exactly the point, sir, Sarah interjected. Someone with access to Robert's terminal has been framing him for their espionage activities. The real traitor is still operational and probably knows we're investigating. The colonel slumped into a chair, the weight of the situation clearly overwhelming him. How do we proceed? We can't just start accusing people without solid evidence. Sarah had been thinking about this problem all night. Actually, sir, I think we can set up a definitive test. If I'm right about who the traitor is, I can create a situation that will force them to reveal themselves. She outlined her plan by creating 3 separate pieces of false intelligence and sharing each piece with only one of the 3 suspects. They could track which piece of information was passed to enemy forces. The person whose information showed up in enemy communications would be definitively identified as the traitor. Hayes was intrigued by the approach. That's classic counterintelligence methodology. But we'll need to make sure the false intelligence is believable enough that the traitor feels compelled to pass it along. Sarah had already considered this. I propose we create false intelligence about 3 different operations: a supply convoy with valuable cargo, a planned patrol into enemy territory, and a visit from high-ranking officials. Each piece of information will be detailed enough to be believable, but different enough that we can track which one gets compromised. Henderson looked skeptical. This sounds very complicated. What if more than one of them is involved? What if they communicate with each other? Then, we'll know that too, Sarah replied. But based on the communication patterns I've observed, this appears to be a single individual operating alone. They're being very careful to avoid detection, which suggests they're not part of a larger network on the base. Hayes was already planning the operational details. How long do we need to set this up? Sarah checked her notes. I can have the monitoring systems reconfigured within 2 hours. We feed the false intelligence this morning, and by this evening, we should know who our traitor is. As they prepared to implement the plan, Sarah couldn't shake her growing suspicion about Master Sergeant Coleman. His behavior during the attack had bothered her, though she hadn't been able to put her finger on why. He had been very quick to establish communication protocols with external units, almost as if he had been expecting the need for coordination with outside forces. More concerning was Coleman's reaction when she had been coordinating the defense during the attack. While most of the communication staff had been focused on their own duties, Coleman had been paying close attention to her activities and the intelligence she was providing to the defenders. At the time, she had assumed he was just interested in the tactical situation. Now she wondered if he had been gathering information to pass along to enemy contacts. The plan was set in motion at 0900 hours. Sarah briefed Sergeant Davidson about a fictional supply convoy carrying sensitive equipment. Captain Williams was told about a planned patrol to capture high-value targets in enemy territory. Master Sergeant Coleman received information about an upcoming visit from a general who would be conducting a security inspection. Each briefing was conducted privately, with specific details that would allow Sarah to track which information was compromised. The false intelligence was crafted to seem urgent and important enough that a traitor would feel compelled to pass it along quickly. Sarah spent the rest of the day monitoring all communication channels, looking for any sign that one of her false intelligence reports was being transmitted to external contacts. The waiting was nerve-wracking, knowing that identifying the traitor was crucial, but that they might only get one chance to catch them in the act. At 1,547 hours, her monitoring equipment picked up coded communications on a frequency that had been used for enemy coordination during the attack. The message was brief but clear. Someone was warning about a planned general's visit and providing specific details about timing and security arrangements. Sarah's heart raced as she confirmed the transmission details. The message contained information that had only been shared with Master Sergeant Coleman. After months of careful investigation and analysis, they finally had definitive proof of who was betraying the base. She immediately contacted Hayes, who was conducting training exercises with his team. "Commander, we have our traitor. Coleman just transmitted the false intelligence about the general's visit. The message went out on the same frequency the enemy used during the attack." Hayes' response was immediate. Are you certain? We can't afford to be wrong about this. Sarah double-checked her analysis. Positive identification. The transmission contained specific details that were only shared with Coleman. We've got him. Within minutes, Hayes was coordinating with Colonel Henderson to arrange Coleman's arrest. But as they planned the operation, Sarah realized they faced a new problem. Coleman was scheduled to be on duty in the communications center for the next 6 hours, and any attempt to relieve him early might alert him to the fact that he had been discovered. Even worse, if Coleman suspected he was under investigation, he might attempt to destroy evidence or warn his enemy contacts that the base had discovered the security breach. They needed to arrest him without giving him any indication that they knew about his activities. Hayes decided on a direct approach. We'll tell him there's been a communication equipment malfunction and that he needs to accompany a technical team to investigate. Once we get him away from the communication center, we can take him into custody. But Sarah was worried about a different problem. Commander, if Coleman has been passing intelligence for months, he probably has contingency plans for if he's discovered. We need to be prepared for the possibility that his arrest might trigger some kind of emergency response from his handlers. The implications were sobering. Coleman's value to enemy forces wasn't just the intelligence he provided. It was his ability to disrupt base operations from the inside. If he had planted monitoring devices, sabotaged equipment, or arranged for emergency attacks in case he was discovered, his arrest could trigger immediate danger for everyone on the base. Sarah suggested a careful approach. Let me monitor his communications for any signs that he's preparing emergency measures. If we can identify what contingencies he might have in place, we can neutralize them before we take him into custody. As evening approached, the tension in the command center was palpable. They were hours away from arresting a traitor who had been operating under their noses for months, potentially saving dozens of lives and preventing future attacks. But they were also moving into unknown territory, unsure of what Coleman might do when he realized his activities had been discovered. Sarah maintained her surveillance, while Hayes coordinated with his team to plan Coleman's arrest. Colonel Henderson sat silently in the corner, probably contemplating how his command had been compromised so thoroughly and for so long without detection. At 1923 hours, Sarah's equipment detected another transmission from Coleman's position. This one was different. Instead of coded intelligence, it appeared to be some kind of emergency signal. Short, urgent bursts of communication that didn't match any of his previous patterns. Commander, Sarah called urgently. Coleman is sending emergency signals. I think he knows we're onto him. Hayes was already moving toward the door. All teams, move now. We're taking Coleman into custody immediately. But as the arrest team moved toward the communications center, Sarah's monitoring equipment lit up with multiple emergency transmissions coming from outside the base. Coleman's warning had gotten through, and whatever contingency plans his handlers had prepared were being activated. Sarah realized with growing horror that Coleman's arrest might trigger the very attack they had been trying to prevent. The traitor's final act might be to ensure that even if he was caught, the base would still face the consequences of his betrayal. The race against time had just become a fight for survival. The arrest of Master Sergeant Coleman happened with swift precision. Hayes and his team found the communications specialist attempting to destroy hard drives and communication logs when they breached the secure communications room. Coleman's face showed no surprise, only resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment for months. Coleman, you're under arrest for espionage and treason, Hayes announced as his team secured the area. Do not attempt to access any equipment or communication devices. But Sarah's attention was focused on the multiple emergency transmissions flooding the airwaves around the base. Coleman's warning to his handlers had triggered something big, and she could see the pattern developing in real time through her monitoring systems. Commander, she called over the radio, we have multiple vehicle movements converging on the base from 3 directions. This is much larger than the previous attack. They're bringing everything they have. Hayes acknowledged her report while his team searched Coleman for weapons and communication devices. What they found was disturbing. Coleman was carrying sophisticated encryption equipment that would have allowed him to communicate securely with enemy forces, along with detailed maps of the base showing locations that weren't on any official diagrams. How long have you been working for them? Hayes demanded. Coleman remained silent, but his equipment told the story. The encryption devices were military-grade, suggesting he had been working with a sophisticated enemy organization for an extended period. The maps showed structural details that could only have been gathered through months of careful observation and planning. Sarah's voice cut through the interrogation. Commander, we don't have time for questions. I'm tracking at least 40 vehicles approaching from multiple directions, and they're coordinating through encrypted communications. This is a full-scale assault designed to overrun the base completely. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Coleman's capture had triggered a contingency plan that involved a massive attack intended to eliminate the base entirely. His handlers weren't just trying to rescue him. They were implementing what appeared to be a final solution that would destroy any evidence of their intelligence operations. Colonel Henderson had arrived at the communications center and was staring at Coleman with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could you betray your own people? How many soldiers have died because of the intelligence you provided? Coleman finally spoke, his voice calm and unemotional. More will die tonight. You should have left me alone. Hayes grabbed Coleman by his uniform. What contingencies did you put in place? What are they planning? You'll find out soon enough, Coleman replied with a slight smile. Everything you think you know about defending this base is wrong. I've been feeding them intelligence for 8 months, and they know exactly how to neutralize every defensive measure you have. Sarah was monitoring the approaching forces and coordinating with the base's defensive teams, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Unlike the previous attack, which had been designed to probe and test defenses, this assault was clearly intended to destroy the base completely. Commander Hayes, she reported, they're not just bringing infantry and light vehicles this time. I'm detecting heavy weapon signatures, possible armor, and what looks like combat engineers. They're planning to overrun us completely. Hayes made a quick decision. Colonel Henderson, we need to evacuate all non-essential personnel immediately and prepare for a siege. This isn't something we can defend against with current resources. But Sarah was studying the attack patterns and realizing something that made the situation even more dire. Sir, I don't think evacuation is an option. They've positioned forces to block all the main exit routes, and the timing suggests they're planning to hit us before any reinforcements can arrive. Henderson looked around desperately. What about calling for air support? Surely we can get helicopters or close air support to help defend the base. Hayes was already on his secure communication system, but his expression was grim. Air support is at least 40 minutes out, and this attack will be over in less than 20. We're on our own. Sarah realized that Coleman's intelligence had given the enemy everything they needed to plan the perfect attack. They knew the base's response times, defensive capabilities, and reinforcement schedules. They had positioned themselves to exploit every weakness and neutralize every strength. But as she studied the tactical situation developing around them, Sarah began to notice something interesting. The enemy's approach was almost too perfect, too precisely planned. They were executing exactly the kind of attack that would work against the base's standard defensive protocols, but they were also following predictable patterns based on the intelligence Coleman had provided. Commander, she said suddenly, I think we can turn Coleman's intelligence against them. Hayes looked up from his coordination efforts. What do you mean? Sarah was already pulling up tactical displays on her monitoring equipment. Coleman gave them detailed intelligence about our standard defensive procedures, right? They're planning this attack based on the assumption that we'll respond exactly the way our protocols dictate. She pointed to the enemy movement patterns on her screen. Look at how they're positioning themselves. They're setting up to counter our expected defensive moves, but what if we don't follow our own protocols? What if we do exactly the opposite of what they expect? Hayes was beginning to understand her thinking. You want to abandon our defensive plans and improvise something completely different? Exactly, Sarah replied. They've planned this attack based on Coleman's intelligence about how we're supposed to defend this base. But if we throw out those plans and create entirely new defensive positions, their attack could backfire. Colonel Henderson looked skeptical. That's incredibly risky. Our defensive protocols exist for good reasons, and abandoning them could leave us even more vulnerable. Sarah acknowledged the risk, but pressed her point. Sir, following our protocols against an enemy who knows those protocols is guaranteed suicide. Our only chance is to do something they haven't planned for. Hayes made the decision. Martinez, what do you propose? Sarah quickly outlined a radical defensive strategy. Instead of defending from the fortified positions Coleman knew about, they would abandon those positions and create entirely new defensive lines using terrain and structures the enemy wasn't expecting them to use. Instead of following standard communication protocols, they would use unofficial channels and improvised coordination methods. The key is to make them think they're succeeding initially, Sarah explained. Let them attack the positions they expect us to defend, then hit them from directions they haven't planned for. It was a desperate gamble, but given the circumstances, it might be their only option. Hayes began coordinating with his team and the remaining base personnel to implement Sarah's unconventional defensive strategy. The enemy attack began at 2047 hours with a massive bombardment of the base's known defensive positions. Mortar rounds and rocket-propelled grenades targeted the guard towers, bunkers, and fortified positions that appeared on all the official base diagrams Coleman would have had access to. But those positions were largely empty. Following Sarah's plan, the defenders had repositioned themselves in locations the enemy wouldn't expect: maintenance buildings, equipment storage areas, and improvised fighting positions that didn't exist on any official map. The initial phase of the enemy assault was devastatingly effective against the positions they targeted. If the defenders had been in their expected locations, the attack would have been a massacre. But because they had abandoned their planned defensive positions, the massive bombardment was largely wasted on empty structures. Phase 1 is working, Sarah reported as she coordinated the unconventional defense. They're attacking exactly where Coleman told them we would be, but we're not there. Hayes was coordinating his SEAL team's response from a position in the motor pool that didn't appear on any base defense plan. Confirmed. Enemy forces are advancing on positions that appear to be undefended. They're not expecting resistance from our actual positions. The enemy's confidence in their intelligence proved to be their weakness. They advanced rapidly toward their objectives, expecting minimal resistance based on the damage their initial bombardment should have caused. Instead, they found themselves walking into carefully planned crossfires from positions they hadn't known existed. Sarah coordinated the defensive effort using improvised communication methods that bypassed the compromised official channels Coleman would have told them about. Instead of military radios, they used civilian cell phones, contractor communication equipment, and even hand signals relayed through personnel positioned throughout the base. The battle turned into exactly what Sarah had hoped for: a situation where the enemy's detailed intelligence became a liability rather than an asset. They were executing a perfect plan against defenses that no longer existed, while facing resistance from directions they hadn't planned for. But the fight was far from over. The enemy forces were substantial and well-equipped, even if their initial plan had been disrupted. As they realized their intelligence had been compromised, they began adapting their tactics and spreading out to engage the actual defensive positions. They're figuring it out, Hayes reported. Enemy forces are regrouping and beginning to engage our actual positions. Sarah had anticipated this development. That's when we implement Phase 2. Once they're committed to engaging our improvised positions, we hit them with coordinated counterattacks from the directions they've left unguarded. The counterattack began with Hayes' SEAL team moving against enemy positions from an unexpected direction, followed by the base's remaining personnel executing coordinated assaults designed to exploit the gaps in enemy formations created by their focus on the wrong targets. What followed was a confused, chaotic battle that bore no resemblance to the carefully planned assault the enemy had intended. Their detailed intelligence had become worse than useless. It had led them into a tactical situation they were unprepared for. As dawn broke over the base, the surviving enemy forces were in full retreat. The attack that was supposed to destroy the base completely had been turned into a devastating defeat for the attacking forces. Sarah found herself in the command center, exhausted but relieved, as Hayes coordinated the final phases of the base's defense. Colonel Henderson sat nearby, staring at Coleman, who remained in custody and had watched the failure of the attack he had helped plan. "Your intelligence was perfect," Henderson said to Coleman. "Too bad it was about defenses that no longer existed." Coleman's expression had changed from confidence to confusion to defeat over the course of the night. The carefully planned attack he had facilitated had been turned against his handlers, resulting in massive casualties among the enemy forces and the capture of several high-value targets. Hayes approached Sarah as the situation stabilized. "Outstanding work, Martinez. Your unconventional approach probably saved this entire base." Sarah was too tired to feel vindicated, but she was satisfied that her warnings had finally been taken seriously and that her expertise had been put to good use. The woman who had been dismissed as paranoid and told to mind her own business had ultimately been responsible for saving hundreds of lives. Colonel Henderson approached her reluctantly. "Ms. Martinez, I owe you an apology. I should have listened to your warnings from the beginning, and I should have recognized your expertise sooner." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but was already thinking about the future. "Sir, this base needs a complete security overhaul. Coleman's betrayal goes deeper than just passing intelligence. He's been positioning enemy assets and planning sabotage operations for months. We need to assume that everything he had access to has been compromised." As the investigation into Coleman's activities continued over the following days, the full scope of his betrayal became clear. He had been providing detailed intelligence to enemy forces for over 8 months, resulting in numerous successful attacks throughout the region. His arrest and the failure of the final assault had dealt a devastating blow to enemy intelligence operations. Sarah's role in uncovering and stopping Coleman's espionage earned her recognition throughout the military intelligence community. But more importantly, it demonstrated the value of listening to warnings from experienced professionals, regardless of their official position or the preconceptions others might have about their credibility. The base remained operational, its security protocols were completely redesigned, and Sarah Martinez continued her work as a security contractor, but now with the full respect and support of the command structure that had initially dismissed her concerns. The woman who had been called a liar had proven that sometimes the most important truths come from the most unexpected sources, and that expertise and dedication matter more than rank or official position when lives are on the line.